Behind every great man is a great woman, and behind those great women is me, from NEFERATA. The LAHMIANS may not have the brute strength of some of the other bloodlines, but they more than make up for this lack in cunning, deviousness, and their mastery of others. The LAHMIANS are secret string pullers of the world, invisibly exerting untellable control over history. Their immortal plots are difficult for short-lived humans to see, and some that were set in motion in antiquity have yet to come to fruition. In ancient NEFERATA, women were forbidden from entering the priesthood and therefore forbidden from learning magic. This change in the city of LAHMIA under the rule of Queen NEFERATA, who created a sisterhood that enabled women to learn what was previously forbidden to them. Many were attracted to this sisterhood, even coming from the other cities to learn at NEFERATA's feet. By forbidding women from learning magic, the priests of NEFERATA ultimately drove many of them to learning the darkest magic, the necromancy of Nagash. From the most promising of these pupils, NEFERATA chose those who would become her progeny. Vampires of unearthly beauty and arcane learning. When LAHMIA fell, only a few of the sisterhood survived, fleeing at their mistress's side. First, they fled from the forces of ALCADIZAAR, and then from Nagash when he tried to coerce them into being his soldiers and slaves. Rejecting Nagash and the other bloodlines, NEFERATA and her daughters in darkness traveled to the old world. As strange hermit women and the exotic consorts of chieftains, the sisterhood gave prophetic advice as they gathered power and influence amongst the primitive tribes they found there. They first exercised this power in an attack of the kingdom of Strigos, which had fallen under the rule of NEFERATA's brother, Ushoran. After the fall of Murkane, the LAHMIANS exercised their power a second time, raising an army to take Silver Pinnacle from the dwarfs and make it their own. From Silver Pinnacle, NEFERATA coordinated the LAHMIANS and their manipulations. As human civilizations changed, so too did they, growing from consorts and hermits to eccentric nobles and seductive spies. Remaining in her stronghold, NEFERATA too changed, growing cold and idle. As she fell into the malaise that claims many ancient vampires, her control of her agents waned. Their loyalty was tested, and some, like Lady Duck of Bretonia, defied her rules to make get of who they would. Others, like Duck's granddaughter in darkness, KATTARIN, the vampire Tsarina of Kislev, defied NEFERATA by seeking power, preferring to rule the humans now rather than at some ill-defined and distant time when their queen deemed it right. For a time, LAHMIANS squabbled and fought amongst themselves. Those loyal to NEFERATA schemed against those who went rogue in a conflict that took place in the shadows and was rarely seen by mortal men. Eventually, the wisdom of NEFERATA was proven right. The vampire Tsarina was cast down by a society of Kislevites, and she became a symbol for the danger of displaying the vampire's power before the world was ready to kneel before it. However, a fracture remained, and rogue LAHMIANs who are not of the Sisterhood persist to this day. Knowing little of their heritage, they act independently, refuse to partake in the intrigues of NEFERATA, and bow to no one. The Sisterhood remains hidden, gathering power and invisibly twisting events to their own ends. They have been present at many of history's most important junctures, but none can say how much influence they had over events. Lady Lenore, the mistress of Mousillon, was present at the city's downfall, but none can be sure whether she masterminded or merely observed the affair. Similarly, Countess Chavot is known to have walked the streets of Mortheim shortly after its cursing, and the vampiress Serutat had the ear of many an Arabi's court at the time of the Crusades. Historians who pry into these matters find in them only their downfall, and many curious scholars have come to curious ends, investigating things best left unknown. And now, onto their plots and machinations. The ultimate aim of the LAHMIAN Sisterhood is the ultimate aim of NEFERATA herself, a triumphant return to the city of Lahmia, where she may rule as the queen of a new cult of blood that worships only her. This has not proven easy to achieve. Lahmia, indeed the entire land of the dead, is controlled by the Tomb Kings. Still, the Sisterhood sponsors expeditions to the land of the dead to battle these dread lords or to recover items belonging to them. The tomb robbers, crusaders, and explorers who make up these expeditions are unaware of the true motives of the mysterious women who act as their patrons. It would not be enough to regain Lahmia through force of arms if it were still a city of ruins. Lahmia must be regained as it was at its height, complete with a population of willing and worshipful slaves. To this end, the Sisterhood has devotees amongst the nobility, deluded pawns and lovers who will one day, when their dominion is complete, lead their people south. Additionally, those people must be willing blood cattle, unable to fight back. To this end, the LAHMIANs manipulate religious conflicts, stirring up the age-old enmity between the cults of Sigmar and Ulrik and Ronald and Shalia, and so on. Simultaneously, they encourage humanistic ideas, helping agitators spread the word that the gods are deceivers who have grown weak and old and should be disowned. Their hope is to create a world in which the gods are abandoned, and without holy protection, their prey dare not resist. They have also protected mankind by strengthening them against other threats. It would achieve nothing to rule humanity, only to watch them fall before the forces of chaos. Nor would it do to have the old world fall to the von Carsteins, whose control of the nobility of Sylvania and periodic attempts to wage war on the Empire have been thorns in NEFERATA's side. She has grown to hate all of the other bloodlines over the years for their failure to hold Lahmia. Their betrayal when they allowed Vashanesh to lead them rather than her, and the sin of existing and daring to rival her. Amongst her goals is the downfall and enslavement of the other bloodlines. It was due to NEFERATA that the primitive tribes attacked Strigos. Nurgle found his passage into the Temple of Myrmidia, where his doom waited unguarded, and the Tsarevich Pavel Society strives against the infiltration of the von Carsteins to this day. And now, onto their society. Uniquely amongst the bloodlines, the Lahmians live alongside humanity, not in distant towers, castles, or crypts, but in the mansions and palaces of high society, as befits their station. They move invisibly amongst their victims, performing a dance that has many rules and complicated steps. At the top of the Lahmian society is NEFERATA. Though she rarely leaves the Silver Pinnacle, she remains in touch with her sisterhood through a network of mortal messengers and magical scrying. Her most favored servants are given the title Nuncio. They are envoys, secret diplomats charged with shaping history. They usually maintain households of loyal servants, including lower-ranked sisters and mortals who help them maintain the illusion of noble normality. Immediately beneath them are the inter-nuncios, who, rather than living in their own mansions and posing as eccentric ladies as the nuncios do, live in the households of others as loyal wives and daughters, gathering information and manipulating those around them through subtle means. Hiding in plain sight amongst the nobility is an easier task than it may seem. Noble women are expected to behave in a highly codified way, and those who follow the laws of etiquette are allowed their eccentricities. Amongst the things proper ladies do not do is go out hunting, tour the estate, inspect the surrounding villages, or go to war. They remain at home, keeping house and maintaining their complexion. When they do leave the house, it is for social events like gala balls or opening evenings at the theater. The majority of these events happen to take place at night. As staying up late is a privilege of the ruling class who do not need to rise early for a hard day's work, it is considered perfectly normal, even fashionable, for the wealthy to stay up until the early hours. Only peasants eat before dusk. High society dines as late as midnight. On occasions when they are required to go out by day, a ladylike parasol can prevent a Lahmian from visibly smoking in the sun should she be forced to step down from her covered litter or coach. Sunlight is not the only thing a sister needs to avoid. Holy symbols and mirrors can both reveal a vampire's true self. Although some Lahmians are lucky enough to be immune to holiness, this is not true of the entire bloodline. Part of the training sisters undergo in the Silver Pinnacle is a partial desensitization to holiness, so the instinct to flinch in its presence is overridden. They may never overcome their susceptibility completely, however, and must spend their time judiciously avoiding and minimizing exposure to the temples, shrines, and priests common in the old world. No LAHMIAN wants to be accidentally exposed by a clumsy priest wearing a holy pendant who leans in a little too close. The hand mirrors carried by some are discs of polished steel that distort any image that they are not held extremely close to, and are an unreliable method of vampire detection. Real mirrors are too expensive for common folk, but in the homes of the wealthy, where the sisters dwell, wall mirrors are a status symbol. Another aspect of NEFERATA's training is the subtle avoidance of such mirrors, ducking to smooth a wrinkle in one's skirts at the right moment, or distracting the attention of observers. Sometimes a sister may resort to the clumsy method of accidentally breaking a mirror that threatens to expose her. In addition to the sisterhood are NEFERATA's handmaidens, the deathless court of the Silver Pinnacle. There, they learn the ways of the LAHMIANS, practicing their wiles on the foolish mortals who visit the pinnacle, hoping to trade with that community of isolated, rich strangers, discover the stores of knowledge they are reputed to hide, or gaze upon the most beautiful woman in the old world. The handmaidens also vie for NEFERATA's attention, practicing their manipulations on each other in the Deathless Court Society in miniature, where they may betray while smiling sweetly. There are also LAHMIANs in the wider world who are not loyal members of the Sisterhood, but rogue agents who do not bow to NEFERATA. Some use their abilities for their own ends, rejecting NEFERATA's dream of LAHMIA reborn. Others disobey their queen for gentler reasons, as the example of NEFERATA and Vashanesh and even Vlad and Isabella shows. The hearts of vampires are vulnerable to more than merely sharpened stakes. Even the undead may know something akin to love. More than once, a LAHMIAN has grown too fond of her mortal target, and either refused to end his life when the order came, or made him her get, contrary to the wishes of NEFERATA. These rogues are shunned by their sisters, sometimes even hunted down and destroyed, though NEFERATA's loyal daughters find little pleasure in disposing of their wayward kin. And at last, onto their feeding and breeding process. To avoid attracting unwanted attention, LAHMIANs tend to feed on willing victims. Some are men who believe they are engaged in passionate affairs, not realizing every torrid memory they have is a suggestion left behind by a sated vampire. Others are knowing participants, only too willing to bare their necks in return for favors the powerful sisterhood is able to grant. These acolytes of the LAHMIANs may perform other services for their mistress. Love-struck and loyal, they do everything from carrying her litter to guarding her whilst she sleeps. Each dreams of becoming her eternal paramour, but only the rarest of them ever do. The LAHMIANs can be fickle, and when they tire of their playthings, most feel no regrets about ending them. They try not to drain their victims dry too often, but when it happens, as it does on occasion, they are never so gauche as to leave a bloodless corpse lying in the street. Such things invite all manner of questions and investigations that can be difficult to cover up, and may even involve having those dreadful, scruffy watchmen stomping around the parlor. There is a distinction between members of the LAHMIAN bloodline and full members of the LAHMIAN sisterhood. Young women with the desirable attributes, allure being one of them, are invited to join the bloodline and sent to the Silver Pinnacle, where they act as handmaidens to Neferata. Here they train in various arts, magical and manipulative, at the feet of their queen. Those who excel are made members of the sisterhood and sent into the world to further Neferata's aims. But there are those who do not join the sisterhood and remain at the Silver Pinnacle serving their queen, passing on their knowledge to the young bloods, and if they are truly favored by Neferata, tending to her many cats. Some LAHMIANS bypass this period of training and make the leap directly from mortal life into the sisterhood. Usually these are women in positions of power, useful to the LAHMIANS already, such as widows with control over their late husband's estates, or young ladies about to enter into prestigious marriages. They are promoted directly into the sisterhood and trained by their mothers in darkness in the field, so that they may keep their former identities and maintain the illusion of mortality. Rarer still are those males who impress them enough to be invited into the bloodline. It has been known to happen that an exceptional man joins the LAHMIANS, but although they join the bloodline, they are never allowed full access to the inner circle of the Silver Pinnacle and, of course, are never considered members of the sisterhood. Neferata, which translates to beautiful death in ancient KATTARIN, is the self-proclaimed Queen of Lahmia, the Queen of the Silver Pinnacle, the first of the vampires, and the founder and head of the LAHMIAN sisterhood. Queen Neferata is one of the most ancient and powerful vampires to still exist within the world of today, owing much of her success to her own seductive beauty, a cunning demeanor, and a secret network of exquisitely beautiful female vampire spies that has since infiltrated the aristocracy of all the human kingdoms of the old world. Sitting upon her luxurious throne within the former dwarf fortress city of the Silver Pinnacle, Queen Neferata had, since the time of her exile from the lands of Nekara, been plotting and weaving a web of intrigue and alliances from all the remaining vampiric bloodlines, hoping to unite or enslave them under her rule as she seeks to reinstate the city of Lahmia to its former glory, rebuild the Temple of Blood, and reinstate herself as the city's eternal queen. Neferata, then Neferatem, was the daughter of King LAHMIZASH of Nekara, and as a girl, she expressed a wish to join the mortuary cult. Her father laughed at her and explained that women could not join the priesthood and, indeed, could never learn magic. Instead, she was destined to rule the city of Lahmia when she came of age. Under the malign influence of High Priest Vasoran, one of Nagash's spies, she used this position to save some of the great necromancer's works from the pyres and study them herself. With these works and Vasoran's aid, she distilled the elixir of life, and they became the first vampires. They cast the priests out of Lahmia and replaced them with their own cult dedicated to Nagash, based around the Temple of Blood. Not all the people of Lahmia appreciated this. You are mine, ALCADIZAAR. Together we shall rule Nehekhara until the end of time. From NEFERATA. The mortuary cult of Lahmia cut all its ties with the priests of other cities and began a reformation of its principles, encouraging female priests to join. The temple was rebuilt using stones taken from buildings of Khemri destroyed on Nagash's defeat, and the chambers of the temple glittered with gold and were decorated with statues and hieroglyphs telling the story of his rise to power. It became the Temple of Blood. The cults of the other gods found themselves falling out of favor, struggling to be heard at court, and many of those priests left. Neferatum invited her cousin, Khalida Neferer, the warrior queen of Libaras, to join her cult. Khalida rejected her offer, suspicious of the changes going on in Lahmia and devout in her own worship of Asaf, the asp goddess. Worried that Khalida knew her secret, Neferatum accused her cousin of treason and attempted to assassinate her during a feast, drawing her into a duel before all the nobles of the Lahmian court. Neferatum's vampiric strength gave her victory, and whilst Khalida lay dying, the vampire bit her own tongue and kissed her cousin, transferring her curse. Devout Khalida prayed as she died, and her prayer was answered. Asaf drew the taint out of her blood and replaced it with poison, granting Khalida a holy death. It is said that although her death was holy, it was not complete, and Khalida lived on as the eternal guardian of Asaf's temple. Neferatum, thwarted in her attempt to gain a powerful ally, cast the remaining priests of the other gods out of Lahmia. During this period of change, Neferatum had been secretly feeding on the populace of her city, arousing the suspicion of Aborash, the love-struck captain of her guards. Aborash was horrified to discover his love's true nature, but he could not long resist her commands. He drank of the elixir of life at her bidding, and as his nature changed, so too did his protests. Neferatum and Vasoran spread their curse to many at the Lahmian court this way, including Chief Judge Matmasis and the court vizier Harakt. So began her deathless court. The Trueborns would be the masters of the lesser vampires they created. Aborash still felt twinges of his goodness from life, and created a set of rules for the Trueborn to follow, ostensibly as a way of protecting themselves from discovery. They would only prey on criminals and slaves, not ordinary citizens from then on. Also, they were forbidden from feuding amongst themselves, and no true-born could kill another. Thus, when Neferatam's brother, Ushoran, learned of the elixir and stole a draught of it for himself, she could not punish him, and Ushoran, the lowly lord of masks, was permitted to join the Deathless Court. Under its ageless queen, Lahmia became a city known for its religious intolerance and the harshness of its laws. Agents of the other cities began stirring up rebellion, horrified by the spread of the cult of blood and its veneration of Nagash, the great heretic. When the insurrection came, it was more brutally destroyed by Neferatam than the previous rebellion, earning her the name Neferata, meaning beautiful death. Your obsession with this man is going to destroy us all. You mark my words, Neferata. One day, Lahmia will burn, and ALCADIZAAR will be the cause. From Ushoran. ALCADIZAAR was the eldest son of King Atenheru, priest king of Kemri. The queen of Rasetra and wife of Atenheru had a troubled pregnancy, and fearing the death of her first child, the queen desperately came to the city of Lahmia and begged for her child's life at the Temple of Blood. There, Neferata gave the woman an infusion containing her blood, and when the boy was born, claimed him as her own, saying he would stay in Lahmia until he came of age and took his throne in Kemri. This child would be called ALCADIZAAR. Neferata grew to believe that he would become her latest partner, and had him trained in every aspect of war and statehood. Given unnatural life by Neferata's blood, ALCADIZAAR stayed within Lahmia for many decades, postponing his rights to the throne of Kemri in hopes of achieving greater glory and prosperity for his kingdom, should he promise to marry Neferata and join the two cities in holy union. By his 50th year, ALCADIZAAR, still as young, vigorous, and handsome as he was in the prime of his youth, finished his indoctrination and was tricked into drinking from the elixir of life, thus going into the process of becoming a vampire. Disgusted by his own queen's treachery, he managed to escape her grasp when Ubaid, his former mentor, sacrificed himself to give him time to escape. When he escaped, Neferata chased her former lover and future husband throughout the streets of her own city, her true features revealed for what they truly are. ALCADIZAAR managed to escape, and this event only darkened the already bleak soul of the Vampire Queen. There has to be a way to stop them. There has to be. I'll die the true death before I give up this city, and I'll see the rest of you die with me. There must be a way to stop them. There must be. I'll die the true death before I give up this city, and I'll see the rest of you die with me. From Neferata. Following ALCADIZAAR's disappearance and the failed rebellion, the other cities of Nehekara still wished harm to come to Lahmia. General Setep of Kemri, whose legion had conquered lands as far away as the south of what would later become the Empire, was foremost amongst this coalition. Amongst his soldiers was a masterful tactician called Vashanesh, who was of Nagash's own blood. Betraying Setep, Vashanesh traveled to Lahmia to warn them of this planned attack. Vashanesh so impressed Neferata, she gave him the last of the elixir of life, which none have been able to recreate since, and made him her husband, king of Lahmia and co-ruler of its growing population of vampires. Together, they plotted to keep the other cities of Nehekara distant from each other, creating a network of spies that split the nation for centuries, disrupting all attempts to unify the people against them. After centuries of uncontested rule, it was King ALCADIZAAR the Conqueror who finally managed to mobilize the disparate armies and bring war to Lahmia by invoking the names of the old gods of Nehekara and revealing the true nature of Lahmia's ruling caste. He laid siege to the city at the head of an army composed of warriors from all of the other cities, as well as the territories he had added to the realm, carved out of Araby and the Southlands. Arriving at the city, they were horrified to be met not only by the military of Lahmia, but also by an army of the dead raised from their rest by Vasoran. Fighting back their fear, ALCADIZAAR's troops brought battle to the undead. Though outnumbered, the army of Lahmia could be continually replenished, the dead rising as soon as they fell. Their mortal followers proved less reliable, and traitors amongst them turned against their masters and allowed the Nehekarans to storm the city. The chariots of the Jackal Squadron of Marak coated the streets with blood, and those vampires who did not flee were forced to do battle on the steps of the temple. Aborash led the defense for a full week, withstanding the spells of Zandri's high priests and the alchemical fire of their war machines. Finally, the temple was burned to the ground, and Aborash was forced to flee with several of his sons in darkness. The last of his compassion for the living finally burned out of him. They traveled far, and their slaughter of the orcs of what later became the Badlands is still famed. The other surviving vampires, including Neferata, Vasoran, Ushoran, Matmasis, and Herakt, fled to the north, where they came across a reborn Nagash in the midst of raising an undead army of his own. I fell in love with him the moment I met him. There was something about him, his eyes, the way he carried himself, as if he were something more than human, even when he was still mortal. From Queen Neferata on Vashanesh, known also as Vlad von Carstein. It was no coincidence that the vampires came across Nagash. Through his agent, Vasoran, Nagash had manipulated them from the first, and lent them his magical aid from a distance during the siege of Lahmia. When Neferata learned the full extent of Vasoran's manipulation, she was furious, even more so when Nagash passed her over to offer his distant relative Vashanesh a position as leader of his forces. Nagash had crafted a ring that would allow the vampire who wore it to return from the dead even more easily than they already could. But through that ring, Nagash would control all of vampire kind. Vashanesh accepted the ring, and at Nagash's command, the vampires led his army to Khemri. Although at first the vampires were eager to serve as Nagash's lieutenants to gain revenge on ALCADIZAAR and regain Lahmia, it became apparent their survival was irrelevant to Nagash. He hurled them carelessly against the enemy as he would his mindless, undead troops, and he cared not for rebuilding Lahmia, and sought instead to destroy all of Nehekara. Bound by the power of the ring, Vashanesh wore, they were unable to disobey Nagash or even his second-in-command, Arkan the Black. Vashanesh hit on an ingenious solution to the problem. Suspecting the control Nagash exerted relied on a living vampire wearing the ring, and believing the great necromancer's assurance it would return him from the grave, he allowed ALCADIZAAR to cut him down at the height of a battle. The vampires were freed from their control, and only Vasoran remained. The others scattered to the winds after bickering over where to go and who deserved to lead them. Matnasis and Harakt vanish out of history, though there are rumors of vampires in far Cathay and the Southlands who may be of their lost bloodlines. Ushoran settled in Strigos. Neferata traveled widely, influencing the nations of man from their foundings and inserting her daughters in privileged positions amongst them. Vasoran stayed by Nagash's side whilst he cursed and ranted at the fickleness of vampires. Upon Nagash's defeat, Vasoran took many of his master's writings and studied them with the aid of his acolytes and his apprentice Melchior, transcribing his notes in the dread grimoire Necronium. His mastery of necromancy grew so profoundly that he was able to limit the red thirst that drove vampires to live dangerously close to mankind, though the effect of this change was to hideously twist his line's physical form. His reward for this feat was death at Melchior's hand. Vashanesh eventually returned as Nagash has promised he would, and he spent the next few centuries testing the limits of the ring. Even if Nagash had truly died after being abandoned by the vampires, which seemed unlikely, the ring had allowed Arkan to control them as well. Who knew how many other favored servants Nagash had who would be capable of turning the vampires into their slaves? Vashanesh set about mastering certain magical arts to make the ring his slave, rather than vice versa. Raise them, necromancer. Set brother against brother. Let's give our hosts something worthy to record in their pathetic book of complaints, shall we? From Neferata. Whilst many of the vampires hid from Nagash, fearing he would control them once more, Ushoran discovered a fledgling nation who worshipped the Accursed One as a god. The country of Strigos, in the shadow of the World's Edge Mountains, was then ruled by a shaman named Kardon, who wore an ancient crown that gave him magical powers. Ushoran recognized this as the crown of Nagash, which had been born here by his murderer. Enough of Nagash had been absorbed by the crown that it possessed a reflection of him that could speak through it to the crown's bearer. Though this shadow of Nagash was subservient to the will of the bearer. Ushoran saw an opportunity to assert his dominance over Nagash and be the first of his kind brave enough to form a new kingdom of the Undying. Insinuating himself at the court of Strigos, he spread his curse to those he saw possessed of a thirst for power like his own, and eventually his coalition deposed Kadon. Learning a lesson from the rulership of Lahmia, he enforced a strict rule of law, allowing his kind to feed only on criminals. Strigos became one of the most crime-free nations of history. Proud of his achievement, he sent messengers to invite his sister to his court, that she might bask in his glory. Neferata's contemptuous response was to use her influence over the tribes of man to send them to war with Strigos. Ushoran led an army against this enemy, who were little more than barbarians and no real threat to him. Whilst he was thus distracted, a huge orc horde swept down from the mountains like a green tidal wave, engulfing Strigos. Ushoran rushed back to his people's aid, and at the city of Murkane, he did battle with the orcs. Although he managed to slay their warlord, an orc shaman defeated him, and his followers, the Strigoi, were forced to flee as the greenskins demolished Strigos. The Strigoi sought refuge with the other bloodlines, but found none. The vampires had strictly segregated themselves, partly for their own safety, reasoning that in small numbers they would be less likely to either court resistance as they had in Lahmia, or attract the attentions of Nagash, and partly out of unwillingness to compete for the limited resource of blood. As each of the true-born stamped their own personality on those they chose to join them, this segregation became exaggerated, until the bloodlines became openly hostile towards each other. Vashanesh contemptuously killed several of the Strigoi who turned to him for aid. Aborash's blood dragons hunted them for sport. Neferata's Lahmians continued to turn humans against them, and Vasoran's necrarchs used them in their necromantic experiments. In desperation, the Strigoi began dwelling on the edges of civilization, in tombs and in graveyards. Normally, vampires will not feed on the blood of those not recently dead, as it gives little sustenance and tastes of ash. The Strigoi cared not, and fed on the blood and even the flesh of those long deceased. In doing so, they became twisted, bestial mockeries of their kind. And now, to end things off, her character. You come to me with gifts and promises and expect me to be swayed by them? You believe that I owe you the kiss because of your years of service? You are a greater fool than even I believed, and never shall you join my kin. We are guests at the ultimate mask, and your kind is simply not invited. Neferata is enchantingly beautiful, Indeed, though her memories reach back millennia to when Lahmia and Kemri were still sprawling cities of the living, she retains the appearance of a maiden of tender years. From a distance, she appears innocent, almost fragile. She is the very image of a damsel in need of a protector, a vision of divine beauty to be guarded against the perils of the world. Up close, the illusion is dispelled. Long years of cruelty have washed all trace of pity and compassion from Neferata's face, and her dark eyes are windows upon an ancient and wicked soul. Only the adult or the bewitched could mistake her for the innocent she pretends to be. Alas, any who approach so close are likely already prisoners of her fabled allure, shackled to her will by a desire stronger than chains of Gromril. Her home lies atop the Silver Pinnacle, the highest peak in the World's Edge Mountains. Once a dwarven fortress, it was overrun by greenskins long ago, and later claimed by the Queen of Mysteries. She delighted in its isolation, and the windows of clever dwarf make that, when opened, flooded the upper chambers with starlight. Under her immaculate eye, the splendor of Lahmia has been recreated in these rooms, a splendor that is shared with but a few. None find their way into the Silver Pinnacle without her consent, for the lower levels are a honeycomb of passageways, tunnels, and vaults, festooned with traps and guardians. Those who perish in that maze join its denizens in ghastly unlife, though their tortured moans seldom carry into the upper chambers, where decorous gaiety abounds. It is in the upper chambers that Neferata takes her ease upon a silken divan. Around her, golden masks and rare gemstones glitter in the dark, illuminated only by the starlight reflected from the silver-coated skulls set around the walls. Treasures of old, rescued from Lahmia's fall, are here too. Aken Seth, the Staff of Pain, whose enchantments add crippling agonies to any sorceries she wields. Akhmet Kar, the Dagger of Jet, whose cursed edge screams with the death agonies of innocence. These are all that remain from Neferata's time as Lahmia's High Priestess of Death, and she suffers no other to touch them. Surrounded by mementos of ancient days, the vampiress sups the blood of handsome youths from golden cups, and enthralled courtiers play harps, pipes, and lutes to ease the burdens of immortality. Men can seldom be found within these rooms, though Neferata delights in corrupting mortal men of pure heart. She is especially fond of Bretonnian knights, whose chivalric codes are easily exploited. Seldom do these doomed souls entertain her for long, though. Most sate an appetite entirely different to the one that they expected to fulfill, their bloodless bodies cast into the labyrinth below the peak. To a very few, Neferata grants the blood kiss, but even these must take care, lest their eyes linger over long on one of the court's many handmaidens. Her handmaidens hail from every realm of humankind, past and present. Potential inductees are identified by her vast web of thralls, which entangles all the major cities of the world. The chosen maiden's journey, consented to or otherwise, is arranged in secret and fulfilled via luxuriously appointed carriages that no border guard dares challenge. NEFERATA does not give her dark blessing easily, however. Beauty is required, as are cleverness and wit, but countless maidens who possess all of these qualities have been rejected, their blood harvested to provide refreshment for guests with unsophisticated palates. What NEFERATA cannot admit, even to herself, is that some of those she rejects are perhaps more beautiful, cleverer, or wittier than the Queen of Mysteries herself. NEFERATA's web of thralls is not merely a tool for expanding the sisterhood. Rather, it is the Queen of Mysteries' true source of power. The influence of the Silver Pinnacle stems not from armies or sorcery, although she could call upon these easily enough, should she choose, but from secrets that others would sooner keep hidden. There is little that does not reach NEFERATA's star-lit throne, for her spies are everywhere, not just in the human realms, but in Ulthuan and Nagaroth. Even the dwarf halls are not beyond her reach. Scandals, deployments, quarrels of succession, trading agreements, all of these and more find their way to her ears. Some reports are trivial, fit only for simple amusement, but others can be used to alter the destiny of a rival, a city, or perhaps even a nation. These are the tales which seize NEFERATA's attention and cause her to send messengers out into the night. Even the Queen of Mysteries can no longer remember how many great leaders have been brought low by her web of intrigue, how many realms have been humbled at her whim. It is a game to her now, a means of whiling away the centuries. But in those first desperate years following the destruction of LAHMIAN, it was the coin with which NEFERATA bought her survival. She had many enemies in those days, Nagash amongst them, and knowledge was her shield. Nowadays, she knows who will be the next emperor before the incumbent has passed away. Sometimes, in periods of ennui, NEFERATA seeks sport, and she bids her network of spies to reveal her existence to a bold band of fighting men in order to tempt them to assail her stronghold. Such volunteers are carefully selected, for the Queen of Mysteries has no desire to waste her time fighting commoners or glory seekers. Only driven men, such as witch hunters or knights, will do. As the army makes the long approach to the Silver Pinnacle, NEFERATA smiles and readies her own household to do battle. Skeletons, wights, and other dark things drawn to her malign presence. If feeling particularly generous, the Queen of Mysteries will even take to battle herself, slitting throats with a quicksilver grace that would shame an elf, and wielding sorceries lost to the world when the city of Lahmia fell. Languorous though Neferata's existence has seemingly become, still she entertains dreams of reclaiming that which she lost millennia ago. She talks to her handmaidens of one day ruling all the vampires of the known world, of claiming the station that is hers by right. Yet those handmaidens who know their mistress best know that what she truly desires is the return to Lahmia, to raise the cursed city up out of ruin, restoring its palaces and temples to their finery of marble, polished sandstone, and shimmering gold. It is one thing to be a queen in the darkness of the mountains, and quite another to rule in the glorious lands of the south. ALCADIZAAR the Conqueror was the last and perhaps the greatest Nehekaran priest-king to have ever lived, having sacrificed himself and his entire civilization to stop Nagash and his diabolical plot to turn the entire world into an undead wasteland. Unbeknownst to most, he was one of the few Nehekarans to drink from the elixir of life, given to him by Neferata in her bid to make him her newest and greatest consort and king of all Nehekara. Yet ALCADIZAAR was a righteous man, a light which shone through the darkness which began to envelop him and his world. As such, he managed to fight past the powers of the elixir and became a king that Nehekara had long deserved. Through him, Nehekara shone with light and majesty that had been never before seen in its history. So powerful that it may have eclipsed Setra's own dynasty. Yet like all bright flames, this grand and mighty empire of mankind was extinguished, with ALCADIZAAR being the last to die. Now he and his entire people are but dust upon the winds. He was the eldest son of King Atenheru, priest-king of Kemri. The Queen of Resetra and wife of Atenheru had a troubled pregnancy, and fearing the death of her first child, the Queen desperately came to the city of Lahmia and begged for her child's life at the Temple of Blood. There, Neferata gave the woman an infusion containing her blood, and when the boy was born, claimed him as her own, saying he would stay in Lahmia until he came of age and took his throne in Kemri. This child would be called ALCADIZAAR, consort of Neferata. You are mine, ALCADIZAAR. Together we shall rule Nehekara until the end of time. From Neferata. Neferata grew to believe that ALCADIZAAR would become her latest partner, and had him trained in every aspect of war and statehood. Given unnatural life by Neferata's blood, he stayed within Lahmia for many decades, postponing his rights to the throne of Khemri in hopes of achieving greater glory and prosperity for his kingdom, should he promise to marry Neferata and join the two cities in holy union. By his 50th year, ALCADIZAAR, still as young, vigorous, and handsome as he was in the prime of his youth, finished his indoctrination and was tricked into drinking from the elixir of life, thus becoming a vampire. Disgusted by his own queen's treachery, he managed to escape her grasp when Ubaid, his former mentor, sacrificed himself to give him time to escape. When he escaped, Neferata chased her former lover and future husband throughout the streets of her own city, her true features revealed for what they truly are. Yet ALCADIZAAR knew this city well, and managed to hid himself within a large ceremonial urn located at the storage room of a local potter. There, shaking with horror at the revelation he bore witness to. After a day, the prince managed to hide himself within the city's masses. For nearly 8 months, ALCADIZAAR, Prince of Resetra and would-be King of Khemri, lived like a harbor rat among LAHMIA's busy docks. He looted and he stole. He gambled on games of dice and drank sour beer in reeking ale houses no city guardsman dared enter. He killed his first man in a vicious back alley brawl when a gang of sailors tried to press gang him onto their ship. For a time, he worked as hired muscle for one of the most notorious brothels in the Red Silk District, and there fell into the company of a gang of jewel thieves who preyed upon the old noble families who lived in the shadow of the royal palace. That association had ended in blood and betrayal on a moonless night in early spring. ALCADIZAAR had escaped with nothing more than a handful of copper coins and a dying woman's kiss. She'd been his first love, and she'd nearly been the death of him. Finally, the prince judged that his time had come. He was certain that Neferata was still looking for him, but her attention was still fixed on the caravans and the travelers' quarters. The guards at the city gates had slipped back into their daily routine, and his description was changed from the night of his escape. He was much thinner now, and his features were hidden beneath a full black beard. Dressed in faded desert robes and laden with a leather pack filled with food, spare clothing, and other supplies, he passed through the eastern gate in the middle of a torrential afternoon rainstorm. The guardsmen, scowling from the doorway of the gatehouse, waved him through without so much as a second glance. But the prince soon learned that escaping the city was only the first of many challenges that lay between him and distant Resetra. Beyond the watch forts at the eastern end of the plain, the land was wild and lawless, infested with roving gangs of outlaws that preyed on unwary travelers. His hopes of falling in with an eastbound caravan were quickly dashed, as the paranoid merchants and their hired guards feared that he might be a spy for the caravan raiders. Alone and on foot, ALCADIZAAR's skills were tested to the utmost over the next few months as he struggled his way across the plain. He was forced to fight for his life on more than one occasion, but his training and the lasting potency of Neferata's elixir saw him through. The road became less dangerous, but no less easy once he had left the Golden Plain behind. He made his way to Libaras, thinking that Resetra's ancient allies would lend him aid. But the prince found the city of scholars in a sad and decrepit state. The famous collegians were all but deserted, and the palace of the scholar kings was closed even to its citizens. ALCADIZAAR lingered there for almost a month, waiting in vain for an audience with King Pashet. But the royal viziers refused to even listen to him. In the end, he left Libaras as road-weary and penniless as he'd been when he'd arrived. The Wandering Prince. Then let it be so. From this day forwards, you are one of the Bani al-Hashim. From Suleima, daughter of the Sands, accepting ALCADIZAAR into the Brotherhood of Assassins. Finally, almost a full year and a half after his escape from the Temple of Blood, ALCADIZAAR passed through the formidable gates of Resetra, the warlike city of his people. The prince was pleased to see that the city prospered under the rule of his younger brother, Asar. This time, he knew better than to approach the palace directly. He was sure that LAHMIA had agents in the city, and they were certain to be on the lookout for him. Instead, he made inquiries in the market, and that evening he found his way to the home of his uncle, Kenthi. Though Kenthi was an old man now, his strength gone and his vision fading, he recognized him at once. The prince was welcomed with tears of joy. Later, when he had told Kenthi of what he'd seen inside the temple, his uncle wasted no time in arranging a secret meeting with Asar inside the palace. Accompanied by Kenthi, ALCADIZAAR was ushered into the king's privy council chamber, where he met his younger brother for the very first time. Though Asar did not possess his brother's extraordinary physique and magnetic charisma, the kinship between the two could not be denied. Asar welcomed his brother warmly, and over goblets of strong southern wine, ALCADIZAAR told him his horrifying tale. This had been the moment that the prince had been waiting months for. Sitting in the filth of LAHMIA's back alleys, he'd envisioned his brother's face lighting up with righteous rage as he learned of Neferata's crimes. Swift messengers would be sent across the length and breadth of the land, spreading the news and summoning their armies to war. ALCADIZAAR would return to the City of Dawn as a conqueror, at the head of a vast army made up of warriors from every city in Nehekara. But he was to be disappointed. The king of Resetra listened to the prince's tale, his expression thoughtful. When ALCADIZAAR was finished, Asar took a long sip of wine, and then gave his brother a frank stare. Asar had made it clear that he believed every word of the prince's story, and vowed to send agents to uncover proof of Neferata's crimes. But ALCADIZAAR knew that such efforts were doomed from the start. No stranger to the city would stand a chance of penetrating the palace compound and slipping undetected into the temple, and none of the temple's high priestesses could be persuaded to betray their mistress's secrets. That left only one possible alternative. If the great cities needed proof of Lahmia's hidden evil, then ALCADIZAAR would have to obtain it himself. He had remained as his uncle's guest for many months, formulating his plans, then slipped quietly from the city amid the guards of a merchant caravan bound for Libaras. 6 months later, he found himself once again friendless and alone upon the lawless expanse of the Golden Plain. He had thought that slipping back into Lahmia would have been a simple matter. It had been years since his escape. For all that the rest of the world knew, he might as well have been dead. But NEFERATA still hadn't given up looking for him. If anything, her search had turned far darker and more terrible than before. The city docks and poorer districts lay under a constant pall of dread. The streets were all but deserted after dark, because people were disappearing almost every night and were never seen again. Informers were everywhere, searching for men who matched his description. The city guard had tried to detain him at the west gate. When no amount of gold would dissuade them, he'd been forced to draw his sword and fight his way out. Mounted riders had scoured the trade road for weeks afterwards, searching for him. He'd only managed to escape by fleeing deep into the abandoned farmland, where the bandits held sway. There, he blended in with a tribe of bandits for 20 years. His unnatural lifespan increased further by the elixir of life. Prince of Thieves. The people of the desert live and die by their oaths, ALCADIZAAR. It has always been thus. Kassar is a terrible and pitiless god, but our oaths to him allowed us to prosper in a land that confounds and kills other men. We lived in the great desert for centuries, and we were content. Then came Cetra, the Empire Maker, and we were sorely tested. From Ophiria, future daughter of the sands. Through great effort and unwavering loyalty, ALCADIZAAR managed to gain the trust of the desert tribe and began his bid to uncover NEFERATA's coven. Couriers and courtiers were captured and taken by the desert tribes, and soon the secret of Lahmia was revealed. With the threat of vampire kind exposed to all of Nehekara, the kings of all the other city-states had no choice but to send in their support. For to do so otherwise would mean to throw in their lots to the cursed nobility of Lahmia. With enough proof obtained, the armies of all Nehekara gathered under the banner of ALCADIZAAR. In a grand ceremony, he was proclaimed King of Kemri, and thus all of Nehekara as well. With his coronation completed, he led the armies towards Lahmia. Using the specialized armies each city-state had brought to full force, he managed to surround and besiege the great city of Lahmia. NEFERATA being still unresponsive due to the rejection of ALCADIZAAR's love affair, finally awoke from her comatose state and flew into a fury, cursing to the gods that she would rather see herself and every single inhabitant of this city dead before it fell. Undead legions were raised, and it held out against overwhelming odds. Her former captain of the guard, Aborash, led the defense, and the city held on for some time. Eventually, NEFERATA and ALCADIZAAR fought one last duel before the gates of the city, and NEFERATA was so close to ending his life. Yet, at the last moment, ALCADIZAAR stabbed her, nearly piercing her heart. Dragging the body of NEFERATA towards the Temple of Blood, the vampires made a final last stand before its steps until finally the coalition forces broke through. For 7 days and 7 nights, ALCADIZAAR's men searched the city for NEFERATA and her followers, and for the hiding place of the infamous tomes of Nagash. They combed the palace and the smoldering ruins of the temple from top to bottom. And though a great many hidden passageways and chambers were discovered, no sign of the city's secret rulers was found. Even NEFERATA's puppets, King Sothis and Queen Amanura, had vanished, though several witnesses claimed that they had fled to the temple garden after the city gates had fallen and taken poison to avoid capture by the invaders. After a week, ALCADIZAAR privately conceded defeat. Jars of oil and barrels of pitch were brought up from the docks, and the great palace was set alight. The roaring flames burned long into the night, rising like a pyre atop the high hill as the invaders marched out through the broken western gate. They left behind a wasteland of empty streets, pillaged shops, and burnt-out homes, roamed by vultures and packs of fat-bellied jackals. Laden with plunder and filled with weary, hollow-eyed slaves, the Allied armies made slow progress across the Golden Plain, and finally towards the capital. And now, on to the final chapter of his story, the King of Khemri. ALCADIZAAR eventually returned to the city of Khemri and began a conquest of unification against all the remaining city-states of Nehekara who still defied his rule. He reigned in the period of about minus 1200 IC by the imperial calendar. His reign was highly successful, as he reunited Nehekara under an iron grip. The kings of Zandri, Numas, Maharak, Libaras, and Rasetra all bowed their heads to him and offered the greatest of tributes. He was a wise ruler, and the land experienced great prosperity and joy. When Nagash returned with his army of undead and vampire captains, the lands of Nehekara were at the zenith of their power. The ensuing wars stained the sands of Nehekara red for many years. The vampires were mighty sorcerers and fell warriors, and they were determined to reclaim their kingdom no matter the cost. Wherever they appeared, terror and dread came upon the enemy. Yet the vampires, for all their claims of power and immortality could still be cast down to the cold furrow of death. The war swayed back and forth for nearly a decade. At first, the legions of the undead had the upper hand, but then the armies of ALCADIZAAR struck back with displays of tactical genius. The war finally came to an end when Vashanesh purposefully allowed himself to be killed by ALCADIZAAR himself, which allowed the vampires to break free from Nagash's unbreakable will. With his death, the war was finally brought to a close. By the time of the war's end, Nagash sent forth a deadly plague that struck the life-giving waters of the Vitae River. The rivers ran red with blood and poison, and every living thing suffered from the cursed waters. The Leash priests were the only unaffected people, as they were beyond death. This is when the land became desolate, the dead outnumbering the living. ALCADIZAAR sat upon his throne and wept, for he could not fight this enemy with swords and arrows. Nagash returned for the second time, and this time the great empire of Nehekara was laid low, and ALCADIZAAR was taken prisoner. He was brought forth within the dungeons of Nagashizar, where he waited helplessly while the world finally met its doom. His salvation, and perhaps the entire world's, came about when a lone hooded Skaven opened the doors to the dungeon, giving him one of the mightiest and most fell-handed weapons of that dreaded age. Gripping the hilt of the weapon, ALCADIZAAR was guided by an unknown force as he wandered into the throne room of Nagash, with the dreaded fell blade in hand. With the dust clouds of a titanic undead horde coming nearer by the hour, the king knew that he needed to end all this now. With faltering steps, the king approached, hesitating before the towering figure. Aided by a malevolent mental urging, the king struck. At the last moment, Nagash raised a claw to ward off the blow. However, the fell blade was far too powerful to ward off, and clove through Nagash's spell and cleave the necromancer's upraised wrist. In retaliation, the great necromancer snapped out of his stupor to unleash a deadly blast at the king. It was an epic struggle to behold, as the king of the dead and a king of the living fought for dominance of the mortal world. With his last bit of strength, the king once more drove on and struck once more upon the necromancer's decaying body. The king went mad with vengeance, hacking at Nagash with every bit of strength he still possessed, until, at last, his sword's deadly enchantments took hold. Soon, the deadly blade smashed through the iron-hard bones of the Leash Lord, until finally it lay shattered in 1,000 pieces, and the threat to the world was over. With the death of Nagash, ALCADIZAAR staggered away as he looked across his once beautiful land. His land and his people were no more, and the king wept at the sight, despair washing over the fire within his heart. With no use for the weapon, the king threw the fell blade into a crevice outside Nagashizar and took Nagasha's crown from his corpse. The king aimlessly tried to walk back to his homeland, as the crown of sorcery took more and more of his life and soul away. The king walked, his body and soul being eaten and drained, until he finally fell upon the river Mortis. There, the king died, and his body was never seen again. And so came the end of ALCADIZAAR, the unsung hero of the mortal world. KATTARIN the Bloody was the infamous LAHMIAN vampire ruler of Kislev, reigning from 2309 to 2465 IC, for a total of 156 years. She only had one son, Tsarevich Pavel, who was born some time before her transformation as a vampire. The Kalashnikov family bear her unholy lineage to this day in Prague. Not much is known about KATTARIN's reign as Tsarina of Kislev, but her transformation into a vampire must have happened sometime later in her reign, as she bore a son named Pavel, and a vampire doesn't produce children. At some point in time, KATTARIN was subordinate to her mother in darkness, Queen NEFERATA. However, she led the charge which saw a splinter faction of the LAHMIAN sisterhood defy the will of her mistress. KATTARIN was the first LAHMIAN vampire to rule a kingdom of humans openly. The Kislevite ignorance of vampires had allowed Tsarina KATTARIN to keep her rulership of the country even after she became a vampire publicly. The Kislevites have a long tradition of magic-wielding ice witches holding positions of power, so a pale and beautiful woman with magical abilities holding the throne was not without precedent. At some point, she performed a secretive and bloody massacre on the population of the city of Kislev, which earned her epitaph. Her reign was ended when the country's boyars, instead of realizing the threat a bloodthirsty vampire might impose upon their kingdom, actually cared more that having an immortal ruling them meant nobody else would ever rise to the top, and they would be reduced to squabbling amongst themselves for greater shares of power. An alliance led by Tsarevich Pavel finally dealt with KATTARIN. According to legend, a hawthorn stake was used to end her reign once and for all, and that agents of her own sisterhood came and aided her downfall. Her corpse, frozen on a block of ice, is still on display in the Frost Palace as a warning to other vampires. For their part, the foul creatures of the night have taken her as a symbol of the danger of displaying their power before the world was ready to kneel before it. Her vampiric nature is less known, but she is famed for her blood-soaked reign, After trying to resist her need to feed for many months, she went insane and slaughtered thousands of her own people, as well as countless soldiers of the Empire. She was eventually killed by agents of the LAHMIAN Sisterhood, but her corpse remains preserved in a great block of ice, and there are many who would love to see her return to power in the frozen north. Ulrika Magdova Stragov is the daughter of Ivan Mikhailovich Stragov, one of the Kislevan March boyars who guards the borders of that snowy land against the depredations of chaos. She is a tall, independent woman, as ferocious in combat as any man, skilled with the bow, and an accomplished horsewoman. Felix Jäger first met Ulrika on the dwarf airship Spirit of Grugni, as they flew to the far north in search of the lost dwarf stronghold of Karak-Dum. He was immediately attracted by her stunning looks and confident nature, so different from most Empire women. Their affair proved to be passionate but stormy, until circumstances drove them apart. Ulrika was the daughter of Ivan Petrovich Stragov, a March boyar and a distant cousin of the Duke of Prague. He was also a friend of the dwarf Borek Forkbeard, helping him on an expedition to Karak-Dum by guiding to the edge of the Chaos Wastes and meeting the survivors when they returned. She was a skilled rider, having done so since she was a child, and was skilled enough with a sword to have beaten all her father's guards at saber practice as well as the local noblemen. She boasted that no man had bested her in swordplay since she was 15 years old. She was equally skilled at archery, both on foot and on horseback. Aged 20, she first met Felix Jäger in Middenheim, waiting to board the Spirit of Grugni. She had traveled to the city of the White Wolf at the request of her father, who had completed the preparations the dwarves had required, building a way station on his land for the giant airship to resupply. On the eve of the new expedition's departure to see Karak-Dum, she and Felix slept together for the first time. Soon after, an attack was ordered by Grey Seer Thankwall on her father's mansion, with the specification that all women and children should be captured rather than killed, so they could be used to manipulate males such as Felix. Ulrika killed half a dozen Skaven herself before being clubbed unconscious, and the Grey Seer was surprised that she was unafraid of him when she was brought before him, but excited that she might be important to the companion of the hated and feared Gotrek Gurnisson. When the Spirit of Grugni returned, Thankwall prepared to unleash his hidden Skaven on his most hated foes. But as he prepared to cast a spell, Ulrika kicked him in the groin before escaping, throwing his minions into total confusion. As the battle began, she fought her way to the cellar where her father and other survivors were imprisoned, freeing and arming them before also releasing the wizard Maximilian Schreiber. She and Felix were reunited in the aftermath of the battle and resumed their affair. When her father discovered that a vast chaos horde was on its way into Kislev, he asked Borek to take Ulrika and two of his most trusted guards, Oleg and Standa, on the airship to inform the Ice Queen of Kislev of the threat. Although his daughter was not pleased to be sent away from her clan before the battle. As they traveled, the airship was attacked by the dragon Skjalander, and as the combat continued, Ulrika took up her compound bow and joined the fight, injuring it. The airship was damaged in the encounter and limbed to Slayer Keep, KATTARIN, for repairs, where the dwarves decided to kill the dragon. Wanting to reach the court of the Ice Queen and deliver her warning, she and her guards agreed to accompany Felix, with whom she had begun to quarrel, and the dwarves as far as the fork in the pass at Urskroy, and then continue on their journey. However, realizing that she loved him, she decided to accompany him to face the dragon. This time, she struck it in the eye with a well-placed arrow, saving Gotrek. Once it was slain, they returned to KATTARIN, and with the spirit of Grugni repaired, they delivered her message and traveled to Prague. Once there, she and Felix continued to regularly argue and make up passionately, as she hoped that her father would fight his way to the city ahead of the advancing horde. During the subsequent siege of the city, she fell ill and was only saved by the magic and prayers to Shalia of Mux, and the two began to spend time together, getting on better than she and Felix had. Following the breaking of the siege, she and Felix ceased being a couple, and she spent even more time with Mux whilst also being reunited with her father. As their relationship grew, the couple was noticed by the vampire Adolphus Krieger. Count Andriev, another noble cousin of Ulrika's, enlisted the assistance of the group, Ulrika, Felix, Snorri, and Max, in protecting an ancient artifact, the Eye of Kemri, from another collector of relics from the Empire. The other nobleman had already got rid of both his guards and his house magician. Max examined the artifact, but only discovered it was linked to its creator, Nagash, and was struck into a coma, later being found in that condition by Ulrika shortly before the mansion was attacked by the minions of Adolphus, the mysterious nobleman from the Empire. Whilst Felix, Snorri, and Gotrek were distracted, Ulrika and Andriev remained in the vault and found themselves trapped when the vampire forced his way in. Adolphus offered her life if she did not resist, but she attacked. Dodging her, the vampire claimed the eye from Andriev as he killed him. As Felix and the others arrived, Ulrika attacked again and was overpowered and used as a hostage against them. Using her as a shield, the vampire escaped, seeing her as both a valuable source of information on his foes and a beautiful companion. Having pledged to Felix, she could leave whenever she wished to. As they traveled back to the Empire, Adolphus began the process of the dark kiss that would turn her into a vampire. She tried to kill him several times, but was easily overpowered. He also gained much information on her former companions. Several times Ulrika escaped, only to be brought back with equal ease. She found herself taking increasing pleasure in the draining of her blood, as well as, reluctantly, Adolphus's conversations, as he told her of all the people he had met and places he had been to. Once he had awoken the eye, he finally turned her, against her will, into a vampire. Ulrika the Vampire. Once he had successfully transformed her into the undead, or one of the arisen as he preferred to be called, Adolphus left her to continue his plans, raising a horde of the dead to rebuild Drakenhof. Consequently, she awoke alone and confused in a mausoleum cell, unaware of what had occurred. Quickly she escaped, her senses more alive and her strength greater than before. Driven by a compulsion she did not understand, she ran through the building and fell upon a horrified merchant, draining him of blood. This briefly quenched her thirst, but almost immediately she vomited and collapsed. She awoke in a fine bedroom with Adolphus, who tried to convince her to join him as he carved out a new kingdom of the undead, using the eye to compel all other vampires to serve him. He told her that they were now bound by blood and her new strengths and weaknesses. Having followed them since Kislev, Felix and his companions arrived to try and rescue her and kill the vampire. As their allies fought their way through Drakenhof, Gotrek, Felix, and Snorri found Ulrika, and the two slayers moved to destroy their transformed former companion. But her former lover stopped them, allowing her time to escape. She found Krieger, and discovering that her father was part of the attacking force, asked the vampire to spare him, which he refused. As all met for a final confrontation, Ulrika and the sire of Adolphus, the Countess Gabriella von Nachthafen, fought against his control through the eye. As her father was killed by monstrous bats her would-be master had summoned, Ulrika's rage allowed her to try again to break free of his control, aided by the powerful mind of the Countess. Their struggle distracted and paralyzed Adolphus at a critical moment, and he and the Eye met their ends at the axe of Gotrek. The survivors paused, close to falling upon each other, but the Countess offered a new truce, noting that the mortals were in no state to continue the fight. She confirmed that she would take Ulrika into her household and see that she does no one any more harm. Reluctantly, Gotrek and Felix let them go. Gabriella retreated to her castle at Nachthafen and attempted for several weeks to help Ulrika become accustomed to her new existence and to gain control over her need to feed. This proved difficult, and several people died, Ulrika tearing one of the Countess's flock of handsome youths to pieces. Finally, she gained a measure of control when her mistress was summoned to Nuln, taking her protégé with her, although she found more joy in tearing a group of bandits apart than reading the history of vampires or practicing feminine wiles. Whilst investigating the death of other members of the LAHMIAN sisterhood in the sewers of Nuln, she encountered Friedrich Hohlmann, who was investigating the presence of vampires in the city. Although he was suspicious, she managed to convince him she was not in fact a vampire, and they began to work together. However, the search led them to the Gardens of Moor, and when they were attacked by a mob of ghouls, Ulrika showed her true nature in the ensuing battle, much to Friedrich's horror. Unable to convince him to trust her any further, she knocked him out and fled back to the home of the late Alfina Aldrich, which she found had been attacked in her absence. She found the humans of the household slaughtered, and assailants cloaked in darkness still there, who after a short, brutal fight with Ulrika and her mistress retreated. A subsequent conference went badly, with Gabriella being accused of being part of the plot to murder Hermione von Auerbach, her rival, and worse was to come when Roderick von Waldendorf, her champion, revealed that Hermione had bled him and made him her swain. A fight broke out, with Gabriella and Ulrika retreating into the street, and then heading to the Wolf's Head Tavern, where Mistress Matilda ruled. But this, in turn, was burnt down, forcing all within to flee. The witch hunters nearly caught them as they fled the fire, and then they were further pursued by Hermione's men and Roderick. They escaped them, but then ran into a mob searching for vampires, where the maid Lot was tortured and killed. To survive and move about the city, they adopted the guise of a whore and her drake. They quickly discovered that Hermione had retreated to her country home and had apparently invited Matilda to join her there. Still trying to discover what was going on, Gabriella sent Ulrika back to the Gardens of Moor, where she again encountered Witch Hunter Holman, saving him from ghouls. They then explored the crypt, encountering more ghouls before discovering various clues and a huge empty coffin, but found themselves locked. They escaped, but Ulrika made Holman vow not to harm her or her companions. She arrived at Mont House to find that both Gabriella and Matilda had been captured, but she was able to reveal that Ottilia was a traitor, bitter about not having gotten the blood kiss despite her years of loyalty. Then, a Strigoi, Murnau, arrived, his companion having broken the magical wards around the property and claiming vengeance on the Lahmian vampires of Nuln for injuries inflicted upon him 100 years ago. A huge fight ensued. Luckily, Friedrich Holman arrived, killing the sorcerer, and together with Ulrika finally killed Murnau. But then, the rest of the witch hunters also arrived. Despite everything, Gabriella managed again to convince Captain Meinhard Schenk that they were not vampires, and he was dispatched to pursue the fleeing Ottilia. As the other vampires prepared to fake their deaths, Ulrika was given the choice to either make Holman her swain or kill him. She could do neither and put him to sleep, so Gabriella snapped his neck, killing him before they left. Bodies resembling the surviving vampires, including Ulrika, were torn apart as if by ghouls, making the face unrecognizable and left to be found, whilst new identities were adopted and appearances changed. Gabriella was ordered to join the coven in Nuln, opening a new brothel as a cover, whilst Ulrika and Famke began to become friends. Frustrated by the restrictions that her mistress placed upon her, Ulrika broke her vow, stole the coin and jewelry in the house, and ran to Hermione's townhouse to try and persuade Famke to run away with her. They were interrupted by Hermione, and Ulrika was forced to flee the city. She fled north, hiding from humans as much as possible, and after her first unfortunate victim, feeding on the worst of humanity, bandits, cultists, pimps, rapists, and thugs. Finally, she arrived in Prague, following the defeat of Arek Demonclaw, hoping to perhaps find some of her old comrades, but also fearing what would happen if she did. A lancer of the Griffon Legion, Peter Ilanovich Chesnikov, found her fighting Chaos Marauders and let her ride with him into the city. She made her way to the White Boar Inn, finding Snorri Nosebiter, who told her Max was staying in the noble quarter. But she discovered he had taken a beautiful ice witch as a lover. Later, she discovered the victim of a chaos cult and found captive refugee girls held for it. She decided to join them and see where they were taken. She killed the cultists, interrogating one to try and find their leader and release the girls to flee into the night. As she chased the last surviving cultist, she was confronted by a trio of female vampires. They introduced themselves as LAHMIANS, their leader, Boyarina Evgena Borodin, demanding to know what she was doing in Prague. When Ulrika refused to either leave the city or enter her service, she ordered Reiser to kill her, but Ulrika managed to escape. She continued to pursue the cult and attacked a large gathering, but was nearly overcome by the warlock who led it, being saved by another vampire who suggested she learn to be a vampire elsewhere. He reluctantly introduced himself as Stefan von Korn, and that he was seeking vengeance on the killer of his blood father. She approached the LAHMIANS, seeking an audience and requesting to enter into the service of Evgena, but also warned her against a rising cult of Cernesh, pleading that Boyarina act against it. Although Evgena was reluctant to do so, fearing exposure, she was persuaded by Galliana, who counseled that if there was a threat, it could affect them all. She then extracted a blood vow from the young vampire, binding her lightly to her before dispatching her with Reiser to act against the cult. Investigating the cult further, they were attacked by a cultist who threw a strange black dagger at her, missing her heart but draining part of her soul when she was struck in the arm. Stefan later told Ulrika that it was a blood shard. She returned to her sisters and discovered that Reiser could not heal the wound and had to amputate her arm below the elbow. She revealed her knowledge and tentative alliance with Stefan, but this provoked Evgena to declare her a spy. Again Ulrika fled, only escaping as Reiser paid her debt in letting her go during the pursuit. Some of the cultists were later found dead, and she joined with Stefan again as the cult was attempting to steal the vial of Fieremonte. They confronted them in the Sorcerer's Spire, killing several and taking the violin, but were soon met by a pair of huge, mutated champions of Cernesh, one of which proclaimed herself as Judis the Unsated, handmaiden to Cyrena Amberhair. In the ensuing fight, the vampires lost the violin to their opponents. They were forced to flee into the sewers to escape the sun, and after feeding, spent some time together, passionately exchanging blood. Geneviève Sandrine Dupointe du Lac Dieudonné, is a Lahmian vampire whose own life has lasted for over 6 centuries. Notably, she saved the Emperor Karl Franz from an assassination attempt and is generally accepted by Imperial society for that deed. She lives in Altdorf with her husband, playwright Detlef Sierck. As a vampire, Genevieve appeared as she had when she had breathed her last. A lovely young woman of 16 years of age with a slim figure and blonde hair. She retained a trace of a Bretonnian accent, which could become more prominent when she was emotional. Her Lahmian bloodline meant that her predatory nature was less obvious than many vampires, but if her control slipped, her face transformed and her teeth and claws emerged from their sheaths. She often wore smoked glasses when she was active in daylight. Geneviève Sandrine du Pointe du Lac Dieudonné was born in 1842 IC in the city of Paravon. Her father was a minister of the ruling family, and she had several sisters, one of whom, Cyrielle, lived into her 60s. In 1854, the city was conquered by the army of Constant Drachenfels, who had her father, among others, executed. No one could suspect that their paths would cross again. In 1858, the 16-year-old Genevieve met Chandagnac, a male vampire who, after charming her, gave her the dark kiss, turning her into a vampire. During the following centuries, she traveled to Araby and the Far East. For centuries, she sailed between Cathay and Nippon. Genevieve learned Cathayan and met Master Poe, with whom she would spend 3 decades of her life. He told her local tales and taught her some minor magic, as well as facets of Cathayan culture. She eventually returned to the old world. In due course, she met Magnus the Pious, who, as she claims, tried to put his hand up her dress. For several decades, Genevieve worked as a tavern wench in the Crescent Moon in Altdorf. In 2480, she was approached by Prince Oswald von Königswald, who persuaded her to join his quest to sneak into Castle Drachenfels and slay Constant Drachenfels. The success of their quest made her famous. She then traveled to Middenheim and found employment with the Temple of Ulrika as a prostitute/spy, sweetening up foreign guests in the city for the Festival of Ulrika. She was performing her duties when she was captured by the Guardians of Purity, part of the moral crusade led by Claes Glinka. She escaped the slavers of Dien Qing, a sorcerer and Cathayan cultist of Lord Xianxian, or better known as Zinch, to whom she and the mercenary Vukotic had been delivered, and was instrumental in exposing the machinations of chaos behind the crusade, killing Lord Marshal Blasco and revealing Glinka to be a mutant. Luckily, Prince Oswald's father recognized her and was able to vouch for her. Afterwards, tired of the adulation and suspicion of mortals, she decided to withdraw from human society, retiring to a convent of the Order of Eternal Night and Solace, where her grandsire, Lady Melissa Duck, was also residing. In 2505, a restless Genevieve decided to return, having been invited to the premiere of the theatre play Drachenfels. She travelled to Altdorf on the riverboat the Emperor Luitpold, on which she had a brief fling with the ambassador from Kislev, Sergei Bukharin, before she was reunited with Prince Oswald. There she met Detlev Sierk, with whom she fell in love, and together they would manage to defeat the great enchanter for the last time at Castle Drachenfels. Saving the life of the Emperor meant that Genevieve was created a heroine of the Empire, which gave her some official protection, and also enabled her to remain in Altdorf with Detlev. As time passed, she grew more and more concerned that she was a danger to her lover, and following the revelations of the trapdoor demon, she left him. His grief at their parting would spur him to write his third group of poems in the sonnet To My Unchanging Lady, dedicated to Genevieve. She traveled to Talia and became trapped within the strange enchantments of the House of Udolpho, from which she barely escaped with the aid of the revolutionist Alexander Klotsovsky, whom she accompanied back to the Empire. The spy master Mornan Tybalt, the keeper of the Imperial Counting House, then ensnared her in Middenheim using her association with Klotsovsky. He threatened her with being imprisoned in silver shackles in Munson Keep, as well as ruining Detlev, and so, with his agent Baltus, she was sent to kill Graf Rüdiger von Unheimlich. Following these and other adventures, she returned to Altdorf and Detlev, arriving shortly after the implementation of Clause 17 of Antiochus Bland's Sanitation Bill, which called for the burial or burning of all dead bodies, undead heroines of the Empire included. With the aid of her grandsire, who had in fact summoned her to the city for the purpose, the lovers foiled the assassination of Bland, and following his unusual incapacitation, the revocation of Clause 17 was quietly implemented. Detlev and Genevieve were married shortly after. She received considerable fame and notoriety as a heroine of the Empire, and had songs, stories, and plays written about her. She even published her own biography, A Life. The song of Bold Oswald and Fair Genevieve was written after her first encounter with Drachenfels, and suggested that the prince had confronted the great enchanter for the love of his long-dead lady. Detlev himself greatly contributed to her fame with the ill-fated play Drachenfels, which he later rewrote as the tragedy of Prince Oswald. Genevieve and Vukotic, and also his infamous and later suppressed sonnet cycle, To My Unchanging Lady. As a vampire of Noth's inconsiderable age, she was considerably more resilient, faster and stronger than humans. For instance, she could crack an iron shackle with one hand. She did not burn in daylight, but it did make her weaker, tired, and on occasion her eyes streamed. She cast no reflection, and silver burned her. During her time in Cathay, she learned some minor magical charms and some hand-to-hand techniques. Fire is dangerous. She was thrown into a bonfire in the Black Mountains, and it took 10 years to grow all of her skin back.